The title of our video hints at a dark chapter of history, but even the words bloody and painful barely scratch the surface of what happened in Nanjing in 1937. This tragedy was part of a larger, brutal conflict between China and Japan from 1937 to 1945. A war that claimed an astonishing 10 to 20 million Chinese lives, maybe even more, with the majority being innocent civilians. These staggering numbers sketch a grim picture. During World War II, Japan committed a genocide that killed around 400,000 lives on Chinese soil. Today, Binge History will delve deeper into this dark period to explore the events that unfolded in Nanjing and their lasting impact on history. The horror that unfolded in Nanjing, 1937, where the air was filled with a terrifying spectacle. Japanese officers, wielding their samurai swords in a macabre competition, sliced through the air and flesh, their blades singing a song of death as they decapitated victim after victim. They hosted these so-called beheading contests that weren't just a grim display of martial prowess. They were a grotesque tableau of conquest, with the severed heads of the fallen stacked into nightmarish pyramids, reaching into the hundreds, possibly thousands. Amid this massacre, the Imperial Japanese Army, or IJA, operated under a directive ominously named the Burn to Ash strategy. Yet, it was the informal moniker, the Three Alls, kill all, burn all, loot all, that truly encapsulated the ruthless heart of their campaign. This policy, stark in its simplicity, was a declaration of total war, not just on soldiers, but on the essence of humanity itself. Pregnant women were not spared. Their bodies violated as soldiers coldly removed the unborn from the womb. Even more ghastly were the games played with the lives of infants and young children, tossed into the air only to be caught on the waiting bayonets of soldiers below. Before we tell you more about the terrifying and tragic events in Nanjing from December 1937 to January 1938, you need to have some background, for nothing of this magnitude exists in a vacuum. Before World War II took the global stage, its prelude unfolded in Asia with Japan's bold move in 1931, seizing Manchuria from China. This wasn't just a territorial grab, it was a declaration of Japan's burgeoning militarism, nationalism, and a slide towards fascism, mirroring the ominous rise of figures like Hitler in Europe. The catalysts? A cocktail of economic turmoil, a government floundering for direction, and a sting of international snubs that cut deep. Imagine the scene. Japan, a pioneering member of the League of Nations, steps up with a plea for equality among races, only to be rebuffed. Then, adding insult to injury, the 1922 Treaty of Washington blatantly denies Japan the naval recognition it craves, aligning it as inferior to Western powers like the USA and Britain. This wasn't just a diplomatic slap. It was a global humiliation that fueled Japan's fiery descent into the aggressive stance that would soon engulf Asia and shock the world. Beyond external pressures, the early 20th century saw Japan's elites celebrate their nation's remarkable economic and military growth over the last 4 decades as proof of their unparalleled prowess. This pride intertwined with the revival of Bushido, a modern, more intense interpretation of ancient samurai principles, which ignited an intense wave of nationalism, teetering on the edge of zealotry for some. This fervent patriotism found a stronghold among the ranks of Japan's military in China, particularly within the Kwantung Army. Named after a region in China under Japanese colonial rule since 1896, these forces would infamously go on to orchestrate the devastating Nanjing Massacre, leaving an indelible mark of horror in history. If you're interested in what you've read so far, please continue to watch this video and please subscribe and notify Binge History for more fascinating historical content. As for China, whose population dwarfed that of Japan in 1936 as it does today, it was poor, extremely divided, and run from the local level up by corrupt warlords, including the man at the top, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. One result of this poverty and widespread corruption was the rise of the Chinese Communist Party in the 1920s, which by 1936 was essentially dominated by one man, Mao Zedong, who would become premier of all of mainland China in 1949. Throughout the 1930s, the Chinese had been waging a very violent civil war. On one side were the nationalists under Chiang, and on the other, the communists under Mao. The The tide of battle ebbed and flowed, with neither side able to secure complete advantage over one another in the huge country. At the beginning of the Japanese invasion of China in July 1937, the Communists controlled a large area in the south and central part of the country, and Chiang and his allies most of the rest. China is vast, and at the time had a population of over 700 million. Japan, though militarily powerful, could never control the entire country. But Chiang believed that the Communists could, and spent more time in the beginning weeks and months of the war battling the Communists than fighting the Japanese. As the Japanese drove southward from Manchuria and their colony on the Liaoning Peninsula down the coast of China and miles into its interior, Chiang was under increasing pressure from his own officers and advisors to be more aggressive towards the Japanese and make peace with Mao and the Communists for the country's sake. The differences between the nationalists and communists would go on if they survived the war against the Japanese, and in 1936–37, that looked like a big if, at least as far as the government was concerned, and those in the coastal regions that fell under Japanese control. From August to November 1936, the Chinese nationalists and the Japanese fought one of the largest battles of the war, the Battle of Shanghai. This Chinese defeat, which some historians call the Stalingrad on the Yangtze for its massive destruction and death toll in the hundreds of thousands, resulted in a panicked withdrawal by the Chinese nationalist forces to Nanjing, the capital of the country at the time. When the Japanese entered Nanjing, they were determined to avenge their losses in Shanghai and teach the civilian population that obeying the Japanese army was their only course. To do that, they did not attempt to win Chinese hearts and minds. The elements of the Kwantung Army that entered Nanjing went on an orgy of savage violence and terror not often seen in world history. The other name used for the Nanjing Massacre is the Rape of Nanjing. The most obvious reason for this was the tens of thousands of Chinese women and girls sexually assaulted by Japanese troops. That is a relatively tame way to say it. For the next month and a half, girls as young as 10 and women as old as 70 were raped. Those who were not killed immediately afterward, or even more horribly in the act, were assaulted more than once as the violence continued for weeks. Besides the decapitation contest held by 2 officers. But the horrors didn't stop there. Many lower-ranked soldiers acting under orders were compelled to use their bayonets against bound Chinese captives. Amidst this brutality, a few Japanese soldiers hesitated, troubled by the morality of their actions. Yet, under the stern gaze of their superiors and the coercive pressure of their environment, they too participated in these merciless acts. Unfortunately, all too many Japanese, enraged by battle, their fascist, racist ideology, and the permission given to them by their officers and the 3 alls policy, took part all too willingly. One soldier and one unit in particular were known for tying groups of Chinese together, throwing them in a large hole, dousing them with gasoline, and setting them alight. Other units ran over their Chinese victims with tanks and trucks. Those victims, lucky enough, were simply shot. When the rage of the Kwantung Army died down and orders from the government, who were more concerned with foreign opinion than their Chinese victims, to end the massive violence came from Tokyo, an estimated 300 to 400,000 Chinese were dead. Most of those who had fled the city were foreigners and those able to afford to leave. Many of those killed were poor and completely defenseless. In the aftermath, a narrative war ensued. Japanese far-right factions have since attempted to rewrite history, dismissing the Nanjing Massacre as propaganda. Yet, the consensus among historians worldwide suggests that the documented numbers likely understate the true extent of the tragedy, hampered by erratic record-keeping and the chaotic state of wartime China. Today, the Nanjing Massacre remains a deep-seated source of tension between China and Japan. Despite expressions of regret and sorrow by successive Japanese administrations, there has been no outright acknowledgement of Japan's role as the aggressor, nor is the massacre mentioned in Japanese school textbooks. Adding insult to injury, to the more than 1 billion Chinese on both the mainland and in Taiwan. Some of the officers and men who carried out the massacre and other atrocities in China are honored at Japan's military shrine of Yasukuni in Tokyo. Occasion visits to the shrine by Japanese politicians only further enrage those in China and elsewhere who feel that the Japanese have never fully understood the anger felt by those who suffered at the hands of its army in World War II. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and notify Binge History. See you next time.